Typically, you don't see promoters disrespect their assets the way you've seen Bob Arum disrespect Terence Crawford. But keep in mind, he's been taking losses invested in Terence Crawford for a very long time. Here's an article from Dan Rayfield of ESPN, well, formerly of ESPN, on September 2nd, 2016. He wrote, Terence Crawford's resounding decision win against Victor Postol to unify junior welterweight world titles on July 23rd at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, Nevada was a money loser, as most expected it would be. But it did not lose as much as top-ranked promoter Bob Arum thought it would. Arum told ESPN.com that the fight generated between 50,000 and 60,000 buys on HBO pay-per-view, but a stronger-than-expected gate helped offset losses, which he said amounted to about $100,000. We lost a little money, but very little, said Arum, who said all along that he preferred for the fight to be on HBO, but that the network did not have the money in its budget to buy the fight, forcing it to pay-per-view. Certainly, if we had a rights fee, that would have been the way to go, but if I had looked for a rights fee, I'd still be waiting for a phone call. Look, I got the fight on. It was an important fight for Terence's career, and he looked great. And Oscar Valdez won his featherweight title on the card, so it was worth it. I probably lost around $100,000, but the gate really surprised us. We were projecting it to be much lower, but it did almost $750,000, and that really helped us on a fight like this. So, Terence Crawford, for all these numbers he's talking, here is facts. Here is proof. His pay-per-view against Victor Postol did between 50,000, 60,000 buys, and Bob Arum lost what he reported to be $100,000. But remember, this is the same guy who said, yesterday I was lying, today I'm telling the truth. Now that he's so heated with Terence Crawford, he reveals he could have built the house in Beverly Hills with all the money he's wasted on Terence Crawford. And he said he's no longer in the business of losing money on Terence Crawford. He's been losing money on Terence Crawford since 2016. It's important to put things in perspective. Realize that what I am telling you and what I am showing you are facts. Not my opinion from a fan's perspective. Not tilted to support my own opinion. Just irrefutable facts is all I'm showing you. A month before Terence Crawford fought Victor Postol, Errol Spence Jr. fought Leonard Bundu on network television. Here's an article from Dan Rayfield, formerly of ESPN, that was written on August 23rd, 2016. Remember, this is the same Dan Rayfield who wrote the article about Terence Crawford only selling 50,000 to 60,000 pay-per-view buys against Victor Postol. Here's what he had to say. Premier Boxing Champions mastermind Al Heyman's purchase of time on NBC for a fight immediately following the network's coverage of the Rio Olympics gold medal basketball game, which turned out to be the USA's victory over Serbia, paid off big time on Sunday. Rising welterweight star Errol Spence Jr.'s brutal 6-round knockout of Leonard Bundu in their world title elimination bout drew an average of 4.8 million viewers, according to the Nielsen Media Research. The bout, the only one on the 1-hour telecast, peaked at 6.34 million viewers and is the highest rated PBC fight since it kicked off in March 2015. The fight drew millions more viewers than any PBC fights that aired in prime time on the network. Spence Bundu drew the largest television audience for boxing in the United States since 2005, when NBC drew some 8 million viewers for the live finale of the first season of the reality series, The Contender. So Terence Crawford and Errol Spence fought late 2016. In early 2017, Danny Garcia and Keith Thurman fought one another. Here's an article from ESPN, or formerly of ESPN, Dan Rayfield, on March 10th, 2017. The Keith Thurman-Danny Garcia welterweight world title unification fight. For those who don't understand world title unification, it means both fighters were champions at welterweight. Danny Garcia had the WBC belt and Keith Thurman had the WBA title. Let's take it from the top. The Keith Thurman-Danny Garcia welterweight title unification fight, one of the most significant and highly anticipated fights of the year, was a smash hit with viewers. In a meeting between undefeated world title holders in their prime, Thurman, 28-0 with 22 knockouts, edged Garcia, 33-1 with 19 KOs by split decision to unify the 147-pound belts on Saturday night before a boxing record crowd of 16,533 at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, New York, and millions more watching on television. The fight, televised live on CBS in prime time, averaged 3.74 million viewers and peaked at a whopping 5.1 million viewers in the 12th and final round, according to Nielsen Media Research. CBS said it was the largest audience for a primetime boxing broadcast since 1998. So what we have is when these three fighters fought around the same time, Terence Crawford fought on pay-per-view, and his fight was watched by 50,000, 60,000. Bob Arum admits to taking a loss. He claimed the loss was about $100,000 because the gate did more than they anticipated. However, was he really reporting the truth? Because now he's coming out saying he's lost so much money on Terence Crawford, he can build a home in Beverly Hills. Whatever the case may be, they didn't profit from Terence Crawford. However, you have Errol Spence Jr. being viewed by millions and breaking records. He was viewed by the largest audience for a boxing match since the live finale of the Contender Series. You have Danny Garcia and Keith Thurman fighting early 2017, and their fight was and peaked in the 12th round and was viewed by 5.1 million people. When you want to answer why Terence Crawford is not a household name, if you want to dive into the discrepancy between why people know Danny Garcia, why people know Keith Thurman, why people know Errol Spence, and why they don't know Terence Crawford, it started here. It started here. When Bob Arum was trying to milk the cow, although he claims that HBO didn't have the money in their budget, the bottom line is, I'll say 60,000. I will give Terence Crawford the benefit of the doubt. Let's say 60,000 people saw him beat Victor Postal. But over 6 million people saw Errol Spence. And over 5 million people saw Danny Garcia and Keith Thurman. And that matters because you think about the number of people who saw them, went to social media, started following them, may have liked their story, said, you know what, I'm going to keep up with those guys. Terence Crawford didn't even get 100,000 people. I'm sure more people followed Danny Garcia, Keith Thurman, and Errol Spence from those fights on social media platforms than the number of pay-per-view buys TC got that night. That's what starts to create the discrepancy in popularity. Here's an article from Boxing News 24 discussing the pay-per-view sales for Terence Crawford versus Amir Khan. This article is written by Kenneth Friedman, and it states, it's being reported that Terence Crawford versus Amir Khan brought in only 150,000 pay-per-views on ESPN last Saturday night on April 20th at Madison Square Garden in New York, according to an industry source speaking with Lance Pugmire of the LA Times. The fight was heavily promoted by Top Rank and ESPN, and some felt that it was capable of reaching 400,000 buys. But according to Pugmire, his source has it at 150,000. So there you have it. The fight between Amir Khan and Terence Crawford was heavily promoted. They anticipated around 400,000 pay-per-view buys, and what they got via a source is 150,000 pay-per-view buys. So Terence Crawford was on pay-per-view with Victor Postol and sold 50 to 60,000 pay-per-view buys. And then against Amir Khan, he sold 150,000 pay-per-view buys. And that fight was heavily promoted. He said his numbers speak for itself. So far, are these numbers impressive? Terence Crawford fought Amir Khan on pay-per-view on April 20th, 2019. But you know who else fought on April 20th, 2019? Danny Swift Garcia. He fought Adrian Granados. It was Danny Garcia's return to the ring after losing a controversial decision to Showtime's Shawn Porter. That fight was on Showtime, premium cable, and it peaked at 690,000 views, which is standard for a non-heavyweight fight that's being televised on Showtime. Showtime's for the fights that are big and premium cable worthy, but not quite big enough for pay-per-view. For example, Tank vs. Gamboa is a fight that took place on Showtime, and that fight peaked at 604,000 views. When Danny Garcia returned to the ring after his controversial loss to Shawn Porter.
When you see what happened in the ring with Garcia and Porter, did you feel like the decision was correct?
I mean, me personally, I thought Garcia won, but Shawn Porter won. I just feel like I'll stop Shawn Porter with the fight.
What do you think that was the difference in the fight? If you thought Garcia won, what do you think Shawn did to get the scorecards in his favor?
I guess he was just the aggressor. His guys coming forward, so they gave him the win.
You know, in the welterweight division, there's a lot of talent, but there's a guy that's only had one welterweight fight that a lot of people are putting shoulder to shoulder with you. Like the two of you have almost a rivalry, even though you haven't fought. Obviously, I'm talking about Crawford. What do you make of Crawford's first appearance in the welterweight division, and do you consider him an equal or close to the same talent as you?
He had a great fight. I feel like he is an equal. I mean, he's an equal opponent. I mean, he put on a great performance, great showing, and he has a lot of talent, and I feel like that's going to be one of my best fights.
This article is from Boxing Scene, and it was written by Jake Donovan. Garcia Granados main event peaks at 1,468,000 viewers. Danny Garcia's return to the win column was the most watched boxing event in April, but still lost in the shuffle of a busy sports weekend. The former two-division titleist looked spectacular in dismantling Adrian Granados in 7 rounds Saturday evening at Dignity Health Sports Park in Carson, California. The bout toppled the latest edition of Premier Boxing Champions, PBC, on Fox, with the event drawing an average of 1,082,000 viewers, according to the Nielsen Media Research. The event itself averaged 1,391,000 viewers from the 9:45 p.m. hour through the conclusion of the telecast. The bout peaked at 1.468 million viewers. Again, Terence Crawford fights on pay-per-view, and his fight is viewed by less than 200,000 people. According to the reports, Terence Crawford versus Amir Khan sold 150,000 pay-per-view buys. Danny Garcia fights on regular television, and he pulls in 1.4 million people see Danny Garcia, and again, I point out to you, he probably gained more followers on social media. He probably gained more fans that night than the number of people who even saw Terence Crawford fight Amir Khan. And this is what we're getting at. More people know Danny Garcia. More people know Errol Spence because their fights were placed on regular television at the appropriate time. They were placed on regular television at the beginning of their careers, so later on, they can be pay-per-view attractions. Terence Crawford, on the other hand, was fighting on pay-per-view when he fought Victor Postol and only had 50 to 60,000 people watching. So, because no one was able to see him, because he wasn't able to get eyes on his fights, later on in his career, he has the fight on ESPN. He has the fight on ESPN, regular TV, later on in his career when he's being rated #1 pound for pound by ESPN only, though. Keep that in mind. He's being rated #1 pound for pound by ESPN, but he has the fight on regular TV. Meanwhile, Danny Garcia and Errol Spence are fighting each other on December 5th on pay-per-view. The man Terence Crawford's fighting is from England, and his fight can't even get picked up on a respected network in the UK. And it's because of the strategy that was used with Terence Crawford. He was fighting on pay-per-view, being seen by less than 200,000 people when he should have been fighting on regular television. Now, when he's allegedly the #1 pound for pound fighter in the world, he has to fight on regular TV to build his profile, when Danny Garcia and Errol Spence were doing that from the beginning. We're doing that at the appropriate time so they can be placed on pay-per-view on December 5th at the peaks of their career. On November 14, 2020, Terence Crawford fought Kell Brook on ESPN. Crawford-Brook bout peaked at 2,078,000 viewers on ESPN, averaged 2,029,000. Terence Crawford's fourth-round technical knockout of Kell Brook was watched by more viewers Saturday night than his previous ESPN appearance. Nielsen Media Research viewership figures released Tuesday indicated ESPN's Crawford-Brook main event attracted a peak audience of 2,078,000 from MGM Grand Conference Center in Las Vegas. An average of 2,029,000 viewers watched the Crawford-Brook bout, a WBO welterweight title fight that lasted only 13 minutes and 14 seconds. Crawford's prior ESPN fight, a ninth-round stoppage of mandatory challenger Kavaliauskas, also known as the Mean Machine, drew an average audience of 1,481,000 last December 14th from Madison Square Garden in New York. The peak viewership of that telecast came in the opener of a triple header, when 1,648,000 tuned in to watch the early portion of Michael Conlan's 10th round unanimous decision victory over Olympic rival Vladimir Nikitin in a featherweight fight. On the other hand, on March 16, 2019, Errol Spence Jr. made his pay-per-view debut, and his pay-per-view debut was met with success. In an article by Dan Rayfield, formerly of ESPN, written on March 27, 2019, Spence Garcia tops 360,000 pay-per-view buys. Welterweight world title holder Errol Spence Jr. shut down decision over four-division title holder Mikey Garcia in a meeting of two of boxing's pound-for-pound best, generated more than 360,000 pay-per-view buys. A source with knowledge of the sales told ESPN. Spence, who retained his title for the third time, easily defeated Garcia, a reigning lightweight titleist who moved up two weight divisions for the fight he campaigned for. On March 16th, before a crowd of 47,525 at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas, in the main event of the first ever Fox Sports pay-per-view card. Now, when you take a look at that, notice what they call Mikey Garcia, a pound-for-pound great, because that's how he was being promoted. There were people like the great Sugar Ray Leonard, I believe, who picked Mikey Garcia to beat Errol Spence Jr. Of course, after he walks through Mikey Garcia, everyone dismisses it and says, oh, it was light work. But going into the fight, there were really pundits and people with knowledge of the sweet science who picked Mikey Garcia to beat Errol Spence. And there were people who were intrigued by this fight, which was why it sold 360,000 pay-per-view buys. Fun fact, Errol Spence Jr. sold more pay-per-view buys in one fight than Terence Crawford has done in his entire career. I.e., Spence versus Mikey Garcia. When Terence Crawford fought Victor Posto on pay-per-view, it was a loss, remember? 50 to 60,000 pay-per-view buys, and Bob Arum came out saying that he took a loss. Bob Arum didn't start saying that he was taking losses promoting Terence Crawford this week. He's been saying it. The proof is in the pudding. You saw the proof. Another fact that cannot be disputed is that Errol Spence Jr. has sold more pay-per-view buys in one fight than Terence Crawford has done his entire career. Fact. Terence Crawford versus Victor Posto, he sold 50 to 60,000 pay-per-view buys. Terence Crawford versus Amir Khan, he sold 150,000 pay-per-view buys. Compare that to Errol Spence, who in his pay-per-view debut on March 16th, 2019, sold 360,000 pay-per-view buys. Now I know the TC contingent's going to say, well, Mikey Garcia sold those pay-per-views. Well, Mikey Garcia sold those pay-per-views. Well, when you pick a dance partner that has fans and that is talented, is on the pound-for-pound list the way that Mikey Garcia was, because even in all fairness to Kell Brook, he's not rated on the pound-for-pound list like Mikey Garcia was when Errol Spence fought him. Kell Brook's on nobody's pound-for-pound list except for TC fans who make the argument that he was in the best shape of his life when he stepped on the scales. But anyways, getting back to the point at hand, when you pick a dance partner that is a worthy adversary, you would benefit from their fans wanting to watch the fight because it's their belief that their fighter has a chance to win. When you pick a fighter whose base or who no longer has a fan base and their fans don't believe they can win, their fights don't even get picked up. Their trainers don't even show up. Their promoters say to hell with it. Go cash out. See ya. But in this fight, Errol Spence Jr. sold 360,000 pay-per-view buys, and he sold more than Terence Crawford did his entire career. For those that argue that Errol Spence Jr. only had good pay-per-view numbers because he was fighting Mikey Garcia, I see you one, and I raise you this. Errol Spence Jr. fought Shawn Porter on September 28, 2019. Shawn Porter will never be confused as a big-time draw. In fact, it was Errol Spence Jr. who told Shawn Porter himself he couldn't sell out a family picnic. Now, Errol Spence Jr., when he fought Showtime Shawn Porter, still put up better numbers than Terence Crawford ever has in his entire career, and still, fun fact, sold more pay-per-view buys in his fight with Shawn Porter, his one fight with Shawn Porter, than Terence Crawford has done in his entire pay-per-view career. So let's take a look at a tweet from Mike Coppinger. Mike Coppinger, a very reliable source, the same source who wrote the article for The Athletic, highlighting how Terence Crawford and his attorney wrote a letter to Top Rank expressing their displeasure with him not having a marquee opponent. Remember, he doesn't have a marquee opponent on his resume. He hasn't had the big fight. He's expressing his displeasure with Top Rank, which in turn led to Bob Arum ripping Terence Crawford. But this is what Mike Coppinger had to say in his tweet. Sources: the PBC on Fox pay-per-view highlighted by Errol Spence Jr. and Shawn Porter is tracking over 300,000 buys, with the final number generated expected to land under 350,000. Strong business that cements Spence as a pay-per-view attraction. His pay-per-view with Mikey Garcia generated over 300,000 also. On December 5th, 2020, Errol Spence Jr. will headline his third pay-per-view card in a row against Danny Swift Garcia. It will be Danny Garcia's first pay-per-view fight, but Danny Garcia has a history of selling out arenas and producing good viewership numbers. Now, we're about to enter what I like to call the no cap zone. No cap, just facts. Terence Crawford sold 210,000 pay-per-view buys. And that's if you're being generous and looking at it in the light most favorably to TC. His highest rated television fight was the one he had on November 14th against Kell Brook, in which it peaked at over 2 million viewers. The result of Terence Crawford's career with Top Rank, his pay-per-view fights, and him fighting on ESPN on the 14th resulted in Bob Arum taking financial loss and telling the world that he's a bad financial investment. No cap, just facts. Errol Spence Jr. has generated over 600,000 pay-per-view buys and the same number of pay-per-view fights as Terence Crawford. Terence Crawford has had 2 pay-per-view fights. Errol Spence has had 2 pay-per-view fights. Terence Crawford has generated 210,000 pay-per-view buys. Errol Spence has generated over 600,000 pay-per-view buys. Errol Spence's highest rated television fight, by television fight just mean it was on regular TV. Errol Spence peaked at over 6.3 million viewers. Terence Crawford peaked at 2 million viewers. And that was his most recent fight, with him having all the hype from the ESPN machine as ranking him as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. And he still didn't get more views fighting on free television than Errol Spence did. Danny Garcia, no cap, just facts. Danny Garcia has a rating, television rating, just when his fight was on regular TV, of 5.1 million. Danny Garcia consistently had good numbers, whether he was fighting on premium cable or basic television. The thing with Danny Garcia and Errol Spence, both of them generate revenue. At the end of their fights, their viewership numbers, the gate, their promoter is ending up in the plus. They are generating revenue, which makes them a fantastic investment. Investing in Errol Spence Jr. and Danny Garcia has been very lucrative for their promoter. And on December 5th, they will fight one another. With the numbers I just told you, from Errol Spence Jr., early on in his career when he was fighting on free television, to him fighting in his 3rd pay-per-view fight in a row, to Danny Garcia and the success he's had on basic television, premium cable, and now making his debut on pay-per-view. This fight here, I am predicting, will do numbers. So please tell me, objectively, how does Terence Crawford genuinely believe that his numbers are better than Errol Spence Jr.? No cap, just facts. Make a logical argument for me how, based on the numbers, Terence Crawford is a more lucrative fighter. You can't, his promoter already, but tickle me. Is 60-40 really a bad offer for Terence Crawford? He has no marquee opponent, no one on his roster that he can face. He's scraping the barrel of England to bring out Amir Khan and Kell the Shell Brook. 60-40 would give Terence Crawford everything he needs. One, it's an offer to fight Spence. His fans acted like they would never say his name, but now we know he's gotten an offer that he's rejected. It's not a robbery. 60-40 is not a robbery, especially when you break down the numbers. The man who made $1 million bet to Errol Spence was so cocky he made $1 million bet he can beat him. The biggest gamble you can make is on yourself, TC. If you're so confident that you'd bet $1 million you can beat Errol Spence, you'd make a hell of a lot more if you took that 60-40 and then you went and beat him. Take that 60-40, beat him, get the $1 million, and then inherit the kingdom. The same way Floyd Mayweather inherited the kingdom when he beat Oscar De La Hoya. The same way Anthony Joshua inherited the kingdom when he knocked out Vladimir Klitschko. All you have to do is say yes and win. That's the gamble I want to see you make. Otherwise, when you made that $1 million bet, when you stuck your hand out and puffed your chest out and said, oh, make it $1 million, you were doing what a lot of people do. You were capping. You were flexing for the gram. But anyone who can review these numbers and tell me that 60-40 is not a good deal for TC, you know what you are. You a fanboy.